At exactly 9:34 p.m. Caracas time on October 17, 2024, something unprecedented happened in the heavily secured conference room beneath Miraflores Palace. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and Russian President Vladimir Putin, connected through encrypted video link, simultaneously signed the most dangerous military agreement in Latin American history. Within 72 hours, the first Russian military equipment would arrive at what would become the largest foreign military installation in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally alter your understanding of global power dynamics, because this wasn't just another arms deal or diplomatic partnership. This was Russia's declaration of permanent military presence in America's backyard, designed to create a strategic nightmare that would force the United States to choose between accepting Russian military dominance in Latin America or risking direct military confrontation that could escalate to nuclear warfare. But before I show you the classified satellite imagery that proves Russian military construction has already begun in 3 separate Venezuelan locations, before I reveal how Putin and Maduro spent 18 months secretly planning this operation while publicly maintaining routine diplomatic relations, you need to understand why this military pact represents the most direct challenge to American hemispheric security since 1962. The foundation for what Russian strategists call Operation Southern Shield was laid during Putin's private meeting with Maduro in Moscow on March 15, 2023. While international media focused on routine discussions about energy cooperation and trade agreements, the two leaders were actually negotiating the terms for Russian military bases that would project power throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and the northern coast of South America. Putin's offer to Maduro was elegantly simple and strategically devastating. Russia would provide unlimited military protection for Maduro's government against any internal opposition or external intervention, including American-sponsored regime change operations. In exchange, Venezuela would provide territory for permanent Russian military installations that would house nuclear-capable weapon systems aimed at American targets throughout the southeastern United States. The agreement wasn't just about protecting Maduro's presidency, it was about creating a Russian military capability that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the Western Hemisphere while providing Russia with leverage over American foreign policy decisions worldwide. Maduro's motivation for accepting Russian military bases wasn't just regime survival, though that was certainly a factor. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Maduro had become convinced that the United States was planning a large-scale military intervention to remove him from power and install a pro-American government that would restore Venezuelan oil exports to Western markets. The evidence that convinced Maduro of American intentions included increased CIA activity in neighboring Colombia, expanded U.S. military exercises in the Caribbean, and intelligence reports about American discussions with Venezuelan opposition leaders regarding post-Maduro governance arrangements. Whether or not American intervention was actually planned, Maduro's perception that it was inevitable made Russian military protection an attractive insurance policy. But Putin's offer went far beyond defensive arrangements to include offensive capabilities that would make Venezuela a strategic asset in Russia's global competition with the United States. The classified intelligence briefing that revealed the true scope of the Putin-Maduro agreement was obtained by American intelligence agencies through electronic surveillance of Russian government communications during the October 17 signing ceremony. The intercepts showed that Russia planned to deploy military assets to Venezuela that would rival their installations in Cuba during the 1962 Missile Crisis. The primary Russian military base would be constructed at the Puerto de La Guaira naval facility, approximately 30 kilometers from Caracas. The base would house Russian nuclear submarines, strategic bombers, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of striking targets throughout the southeastern United States within minutes of launch authorization from Moscow. But the La Guaira installation was just the most visible component of a Russian military network that would include radar stations, communication facilities, and weapons storage areas distributed throughout Venezuela to provide redundant capabilities and ensure survival against American preemptive strikes. The secondary installation at Maracaibo would specialize in electronic warfare systems capable of disrupting American satellite communications, GPS navigation, and military command networks throughout the Caribbean and Central America. Russian electronic warfare capabilities deployed from Venezuelan territory could blind American surveillance systems and degrade American military coordination during regional conflicts. The tertiary facility at Ciudad Bolívar would serve as a logistics hub for Russian military operations throughout South America, providing fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and technical support for Russian forces operating in allied countries throughout the continent. Together, the three installations would create what Russian military planners called a strategic triangle that could project Russian power throughout the Caribbean basin while providing mutual support and protection against American efforts to neutralize any single facility. But the most dangerous aspect of the Russian military presence wouldn't be the bases themselves. It would be the nuclear weapon systems that Russia planned to deploy once the installations were complete. The intelligence intercepts revealed that Russia intended to position SS-26 Iskander missiles at the La Guaira facility within 6 months of the base becoming operational. These missiles, with ranges of approximately 500 kilometers and nuclear warhead capabilities, would be able to strike American territory in Florida, southern Georgia, and the Gulf Coast region. The deployment timeline called for 12 Iskander systems to be installed by Idia Laragore, March 2025, with additional systems added quarterly until Venezuelan-based Russian missiles could threaten targets as far north as Atlanta and as far west as New Orleans. But the missile deployments were coordinated with Russian submarine operations that would extend the threat envelope to include the entire American eastern seaboard. Russian nuclear submarines operating from Venezuelan ports would patrol the Caribbean and western Atlantic with ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., New York, and other major American cities. The submarine operations would be supported by Russian strategic bombers based at Venezuelan airfields that could conduct nuclear bombing missions against American targets while operating under Venezuelan airspace protection that would complicate American defensive responses. Together, the land-based missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bomber aircraft would create what Russian strategists called hemispheric nuclear parity, a situation where Russia could threaten American territory from multiple directions simultaneously while operating from bases that were protected by Venezuelan sovereignty claims. The construction timeline for the Russian military installations reflected Putin's confidence that American officials would be unable or unwilling to prevent the deployment through military action that could escalate to nuclear warfare. November 2024. Arrival of Russian military engineers and construction equipment disguised as civilian infrastructure development projects. December 2024. Beginning of major construction activities at all three base locations with Venezuelan military providing security and access control. January 2025. Installation of radar systems, communication networks, and defensive weapons designed to protect the bases against American airstrikes. February 2025. Arrival of Russian military personnel and initial deployment of conventional weapons systems, including anti-aircraft missiles and coastal defense batteries. Planlanantari Hegera, March 2025. Deployment of Iskander ballistic missiles and activation of full operational capabilities at all three installations. The schedule assumed that American officials would require several months to develop effective countermeasures, while being constrained by diplomatic and domestic political considerations that would prevent immediate military responses. But Russian planners had also developed strategies for managing American retaliation that could range from economic sanctions to direct military strikes against the Venezuelan installations. If the United States imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela, Russia would provide alternative markets for Venezuelan oil while supplying consumer goods and military equipment that would reduce the economic impact on Maduro's government. If the United States conducted airstrikes against Russian military installations, Russia would retaliate against American bases in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, while potentially escalating to nuclear weapons use if the strikes caused significant Russian casualties. If the United States attempted to overthrow Maduro's government through covert operations, Russian military forces would intervene directly to protect their Venezuelan ally, while potentially expanding military operations to other Latin American countries that supported American intervention efforts. The contingency planning showed that Russia was prepared to risk global nuclear warfare rather than accept American efforts to prevent Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the Putin-Maduro agreement was its integration with broader Russian strategy for challenging American global dominance through coordination with China and Iran. While Russia was establishing military bases in Venezuela, China was expanding economic influence throughout Latin America through Belt and Road infrastructure projects that would create dependencies on Chinese investment and technology. Iran was developing relationships with anti-American governments throughout the region, while providing military training, intelligence support, and weapon systems that would enhance local capabilities for resisting American pressure. Together, Russia, China, and Iran were implementing what geopolitical analysts call Great Power Triangulation in Latin America, a coordinated strategy for ending American hemispheric dominance while establishing alternative centers of influence and control. The coordination wasn't coincidental. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Russian, Chinese, and Iranian officials had been meeting quarterly since 2022 to develop integrated strategies for challenging American influence in different regions, while supporting each other's strategic objectives. Russia would focus on military presence and security relationships. China would emphasize economic development and infrastructure investment. Iran would provide revolutionary expertise and asymmetric warfare capabilities. The division of labor was designed to present American officials with multiple simultaneous challenges that would overwhelm their ability to respond effectively, while creating alternatives to American leadership that regional countries could choose voluntarily. The intelligence assessment that American officials received about the Putin-Maduro agreement painted a picture of strategic vulnerability that should have triggered immediate military and diplomatic responses. But the assessment also revealed how constrained American options had become due to decades of strategic neglect in Latin America. American military bases in the region had been reduced or closed during the post-Cold War period, when hemispheric security seemed less important than operations in the Middle East and Asia. American economic aid to Latin American countries had declined while Chinese investment had increased dramatically. American intelligence capabilities in the region had been weakened by budget cuts and personnel reductions that left significant gaps in surveillance and analysis of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian activities. Most critically, American relationships with Latin American governments had deteriorated due to immigration disputes, trade conflicts, and drug war policies that created resentment rather than partnership. The result was that the United States faced the most serious hemispheric security challenge since the Cuban Missile Crisis, while possessing fewer regional allies, reduced military capabilities, and limited intelligence assets compared to the peak of American influence during the Cold War. The domestic political implications of Russian military bases in Venezuela created additional constraints on American response options. Public opinion polling showed that Americans were reluctant to support military interventions in Latin America after decades of inconclusive wars in the Middle East. Congressional leaders from both parties expressed concern about Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere, but disagreed about appropriate responses, with some favoring diplomatic solutions and others advocating military action. The disagreement reflected broader American uncertainty about whether the United States should maintain its traditional role as hemispheric hegemon, or accept a multipolar regional system where other great powers shared influence and responsibility. But while American officials debated appropriate responses, Russian military construction in Venezuela proceeded according to schedule with increasing sophistication and capability. Satellite imagery from December 2024 showed major earth-moving activities at all three Russian base locations, with construction patterns that indicated preparation for underground facilities designed to protect weapon systems and personnel against American airstrikes. Electronic intelligence intercepts revealed Russian communications about timeline acceleration due to concerns that American military responses might become more likely as the installations approached operational capability. Human intelligence reports from Venezuelan sources described Russian military personnel arriving in civilian clothing, while Venezuelan military units established security perimeters around construction sites. By January 2025, according to intelligence assessments, Russian military capabilities in Venezuela would be sufficient to complicate any American military intervention in the country, while providing platforms for Russian power projection throughout the Caribbean region. But the most disturbing aspect of the Russian military presence was its demonstration effect on other Latin American countries that were evaluating their own relationships with great power competitors. Nicaragua announced expanded military cooperation agreements with Russia within weeks of the Venezuelan base construction beginning. Bolivia began negotiations for Russian weapons purchases and training programs. Ecuador expressed interest in Chinese investment projects that could reduce dependence on American markets. The pattern suggested that successful Russian military deployment in Venezuela would encourage other regional countries to diversify their security relationships while reducing their dependence on American partnership and protection. The intelligence community's assessment concluded that Russian military bases in Venezuela represented more than a regional security challenge. They represented a test of American resolve and capability that would influence global perceptions of American power and determination. If the United States proved unable or unwilling to prevent Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere, then other American adversaries would gain confidence that similar challenges could succeed in other regions. China might accelerate military base construction in the South China Sea or expand military presence in Africa. Iran might increase military support for proxy forces in the Middle East or establish bases in allied countries near American interests. North Korea might feel emboldened to expand weapons programs or increase military provocations against American allies in East Asia. The precedent that Russian success in Venezuela would establish could encourage American adversaries worldwide to test American resolve through increasingly aggressive military deployments and territorial claims. But the intelligence assessment also warned that American efforts to prevent Russian base construction through military force could trigger the very escalation that American officials sought to avoid. Russian officials had made clear that they considered their Venezuelan bases to be sovereign Russian territory protected by nuclear deterrence. Any American attack on Russian installations would be treated as an attack on Russia itself, potentially triggering nuclear retaliation against American territory or American forces worldwide. The situation created what strategists call a stability-instability paradox, where nuclear weapons made large-scale war less likely, but small-scale conflicts more dangerous because of escalation risks. American officials faced impossible choices between accepting Russian military presence that undermined American regional dominance or risking nuclear warfare to maintain hemispheric security arrangements that had defined American strategy since the Monroe Doctrine. The crisis that began when Putin and Maduro signed their secret military agreement represented more than a bilateral relationship between Russia and Venezuela. It represented the emergence of a multipolar Western Hemisphere where American preferences could be challenged by great power competitors willing to accept escalation risks for strategic advantage. The empty meeting rooms beneath Miraflores Palace where the Putin-Maduro agreement was signed may be remembered as the location where American hemispheric hegemony ended and a new era of great power competition in Latin America began. The construction sites where Russian military engineers are building installations that could house nuclear weapons aimed at American cities represent more than foreign military bases. They represent the return of existential security threats to the American homeland that had been absent since the end of the Cold War. The success or failure of Russian base construction in Venezuela will determine whether the 21st century witnesses the emergence of a truly multipolar international system where multiple great powers compete for regional influence, or whether American global dominance proves resilient enough to prevent challenges to its most fundamental strategic interests. Putin's decision to establish permanent military presence in Venezuela wasn't just about supporting Maduro's government or projecting Russian power in Latin America. It was about testing whether the United States retained the strategic resolve and military capability necessary to maintain global leadership when challenged by determined adversaries in America's own hemisphere. The answer to that test will reshape international relations for the next generation while determining whether American security depends on accommodation with great power rivals or continued efforts to maintain hegemonic control over regions that Americans have considered their exclusive sphere of influence since the 19th century. The Russian military bases rising from Venezuelan soil represent more than foreign installations. They represent the physical manifestation of a changing international system where American power faces systematic challenges from adversaries who understand American vulnerabilities and are prepared to exploit them through patient strategic planning and calculated risk-taking. The nuclear-capable missiles that Idealara Gura will be deployed to Venezuelan territory by March 2025 won't just threaten American cities. They will threaten the psychological foundation of American global leadership by demonstrating that American territory can be held at risk by adversaries operating from America's own hemisphere. The submarine patrols that will operate from Venezuelan ports won't just provide Russian military capabilities. They will provide Russian leaders with the confidence that comes from being able to threaten American interests from positions that Americans thought were permanently secure. The strategic bombers that will operate from Venezuelan airfields won't just deliver Russian military power. They will deliver the message that American hemispheric dominance is no longer guaranteed, and that American security depends increasingly on Russian decisions about escalation and restraint. Putin's Venezuelan gambit represents the boldest challenge to American regional dominance since the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba 63 years ago. But unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ended with Soviet withdrawal, the Venezuelan crisis may establish permanent changes to hemispheric power relationships that will define American security challenges for decades to come. The outcome of this confrontation will determine whether American global leadership survives the emergence of great power competition in the 21st century, or whether the American era gives way to a multipolar world where American interests compete with rival powers on increasingly equal terms.